The box was behind the winter coats, not hidden, just placed, the way you place something you return to regularly, accessible, familiar, not on display. A shoebox with a rubber band around it and nothing written on the outside. My grandmother died in February. I was clearing her attic in March. My mother had asked me to do it because she could not yet bring herself to, and because I had always been the one in the family who could organize things without being stopped by them. I had been on the attic for 3 hours. Boxes of Christmas decorations, a sewing machine from the 1970s, 3 boxes of my mother's childhood things that I set aside without opening, then the winter coats, and behind them, the shoebox. I sat down on the attic floor and removed the rubber band. Inside, letters. Bundled in groups of roughly 10, held together with twine, each bundle labeled with a year in my grandmother's handwriting. The earliest bundle said 1998. The most recent said 2021. 23 years of letters. I picked up the top letter from the 1998 bundle. The handwriting on the envelope was not my grandmother's. The return address was a town in Minnesota I had never heard of. The name in the upper left corner was Margaret Osei. I did not know anyone named Margaret Osei. I opened the letter. The first line said, "Eleanor, I think about her every day. I hope she is everything you said she would be." I read that line 3 times. Then I read the rest of the letter. Then I sat on the attic floor for a very long time. My name is Emma Larson. I am 29 years old. My grandmother, Eleanor Larson, died in February at 82. She had been in good health until the last year, and her death was the kind that people call peaceful, which means it was not sudden and not violent, and that she had time to say the things she wanted to say. She said many things in her last year. She did not say anything about a shoebox behind the winter coats. I grew up in Portland. My mother is Susan Larson, an elementary school teacher. My father left when I was 4, and has been a peripheral presence in my life since. My grandmother Eleanor was the most consistent person in my childhood, present at every birthday, at every school play, at every difficult moment that required someone steady. She was the kind of grandmother who remembered the specific things you had mentioned in passing 6 months earlier and asked about them later. The kind who made the same cookies every Christmas, not out of habit, but because she had noticed that you loved them. The kind whose house felt like the place the family organized itself around, even when the family was not explicitly gathered there. I loved her in the specific way you love the people who make you feel known. I had believed, for 29 years, that I knew her. The shoebox suggested otherwise. I read all 23 years of letters on the attic floor. Not in one sitting. I read for 2 hours until the light through the attic window changed, and I realized I was cold and had not moved, and that my phone had 3 missed calls from my mother asking if I wanted help with the boxes. I texted back, "I'm fine. Give me a little more time." Then I kept reading. The letters spanned 1998 to 2021. 1 or 2 per year, sometimes 3. Always from Margaret Osei, in a town called Duluth, Minnesota. Always handwritten. Always personal in the specific way of letters between people who have known each other across a great distance for a long time and have found a rhythm of honesty that only distance makes possible. The early letters, 1998, 1999, 2000, were the hardest to read. Not because they were dramatic, because they were careful. The careful language of someone navigating something painful with extraordinary precision. Margaret wrote about a decision, about a year that had been the hardest of her life, about a choice she had made that she believed was right and that she grieved every day regardless. She wrote about a baby girl. She wrote about leaving her with a family in Portland. She wrote about Eleanor, my grandmother, as the woman who had promised to love the child as her own. I stopped reading at that point. I sat very still on the attic floor, and I looked at the window and I thought about what I had just read and what it meant and whether I was understanding it correctly. Then I read it again. I was understanding it correctly. Margaret's first letter was dated January 1998, but the event she described had happened in 1995. I was born in 1995. I was born in Portland, Oregon, according to my birth certificate, to Susan and David Larson. I had never questioned this. There was no reason to question it. I had my mother's eyes. Everyone had always said so. And my grandmother's hands and my father's height before he disappeared, and everything about the story of my origins had always been the story that was told without gaps or hesitations. Except that Margaret Osei wrote about a baby girl she had left with a family in Portland in 1995. Except that my grandmother had kept 23 years of her letters in a shoebox behind the winter coats. Except that the letters never named the child. They never named me. Which meant one of two things. Either the child Margaret wrote about was not me, and there was another child, another story, a coincidence of timing that I was mapping onto my own history incorrectly, or the child was me. And my grandmother had known, and my mother had known or had not known, and 23 years of letters from a woman in Minnesota had been waiting behind winter coats for someone to come looking. I was shaking when I came down from the attic. My mother was in the kitchen. She looked at my face and she put down the cup she was holding and she said, "Emma, what happened?" I placed the shoebox on the kitchen table between us. My mother looked at the shoebox. She looked at me. She said, "Where did you find that?" Not, "What is that?" Not, "I don't understand." "Where did you find that?" I said, "Behind the winter coats." "How long have you known?" My mother sat down. She looked at the table for a long time. Then she said, "Your whole life. If you have ever found something that reframed everything you thought you knew about where you came from, you already know why this story exists. Subscribe and hit the bell. I'll be here every week." The conversation lasted 4 hours. My mother told me everything, not reluctantly, with the specific relief of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and has been handed the moment to put it down. She and my father had been unable to have children. They had tried for 4 years. They had begun the process of formal adoption, and then, through a connection, a woman my grandmother knew from her church in Duluth, who knew a young woman who was pregnant and frightened and not able to raise a child, the arrangement had been made. Not through an agency, through people who knew each other and trusted each other and who arranged something careful and private and entirely outside the formal system. Margaret Osei was 22 years old in 1995. She was a nursing student. The pregnancy was the result of a relationship that had ended badly. She had considered every option and had decided that she could not raise the child and could not keep the child and needed to know the child would be loved by someone specific rather than by the abstract system. My grandmother Eleanor had been that someone specific. My mother said, "Your grandmother told Margaret everything about us, about the house, about me and your father, about what our life was, and Margaret chose us." I said, "She chose you." My mother said, "She wanted to know." And then your grandmother kept her knowing. 23 years of letters. My grandmother had been the thread between two worlds. The world where I was Emma Larson of Portland, and the world where Margaret Osei in Duluth thought about me every day and wrote letters she knew I would never read. I said, "Did Grandma ever tell Margaret about me? About what I was like?" My mother looked at me carefully. She said, "Read the letters from your grandmother's side." I said, "There are letters from her side?" My mother stood up. She went to the kitchen drawer where my grandmother had kept important documents. She opened it. She reached to the back. She placed a second bundle on the table. Also tied with twine, also labeled by year, my grandmother's handwriting on the outside of each envelope. Margaret had kept them too. Margaret had sent them to my mother after my grandmother died with a note that said only, "I thought you should have these back." My mother had put them in the kitchen drawer. I opened the first one. My grandmother wrote twice a year, January and July, without fail for 23 years. The letters were not long, 1 page each, sometimes 2. They described me without naming me. Always she, always the child, always in the careful language of someone who understood the specific grief of the person reading and who wanted to give as much as possible without causing more pain. She wrote about the first steps, about the first words, about the specific color of the hair and the way the eyes tilted when laughing. She wrote, "She has your determination. I see it when she wants something. She does not stop." She wrote, "She asked me last week what I was thinking about, and when I said nothing, she said, 'Grandma, you can't be thinking nothing. There's always something.'" She was 7. She wrote, "She graduated today. She wore the cap at a slight angle, and she thought I didn't notice. I noticed. I think you would have laughed." She wrote, in the last letter she sent before her health declined, "She is 28 years old, and she is exactly what I hoped she would be. And I want you to know that every good thing in her is also yours. You gave her to people who loved her, and she became herself because of that love. And that is what you did when you made the hardest decision of your life." I sat at the kitchen table with my mother and I read these letters, and I did not try to stop crying, and neither did she. We sat with it for a long time. Then I said, "I want to write to Margaret." My mother said, "I thought you might." I said, "Do you have her address?" My mother opened the kitchen drawer again. I wrote the letter over 3 evenings, not because I did not know what to say, because I wanted to say it right, because the person reading it had been waiting 29 years for a letter that might or might not ever come, and I wanted to be careful with that waiting. I wrote, "My name is Emma. You knew me as she for 23 years through my grandmother's letters. I found the shoebox in March, and I read everything, and I want you to know that I am well and I am whole, and I became myself with people who loved me." I wrote, "My grandmother kept your letters for 23 years. She was the thread that kept us connected, even when we did not know we were connected. I think she knew that someday someone would come looking." I wrote, "I am not writing to change anything or to make any claim on the life you built or to disrupt the family I have. I am writing because you thought about me every day for 23 years, and I think you deserve to know that I am worth the thinking." I wrote, "If you want to write back, I would like that. If you do not, I understand that too. Either way, thank you. For the decision you made in 1995, for letting my grandmother keep you in her life, for the letters." I sent it on a Tuesday. Margaret wrote back in 11 days. Her letter was 4 pages. Her handwriting was careful and unhurried, and she wrote about 1995 and about the years after, and about what it had meant to receive my grandmother's letters, and about the specific kind of love that exists at a distance for something you cannot hold. She wrote, "I have thought about what I would say if you ever wrote. I have thought about it for years. Now that you have written, I find that what I want to say is simple. I am so glad you are well. I am so glad Eleanor found you worthy of every letter. I am so glad you came looking." She wrote, "You said I deserve to know you are worth the thinking. Emma, I knew that already. I have always known that." I read that line many times. I am still reading it. I am 29 years old, and I found a shoebox behind my grandmother's winter coats, and it told me something true about where I came from that the story I had always known had not included. I want to tell you what I actually learned from this, rather than the version that resolves into something clean. The first thing, the people who love us carry more than we know. My grandmother Eleanor kept 23 years of letters. She wrote 23 years of letters. She maintained a connection across 3 decades between a woman in Minnesota and a child in Portland who did not know the other existed, because she believed that the connection mattered, that the truth of my origins deserved to exist somewhere, even if not in the place where I could see it. She did not tell me. I have thought about whether she should have, and I do not have a clear answer. The decision about when and whether to tell an adopted child their story is one of the most complex decisions a parent can face, and I do not think the right answer is the same for every family or every child. What I know is that she left the shoebox behind the winter coats in a place where it could be found, not destroyed, not hidden in a way that would prevent discovery. Left. In the careful way you leave something you expect will be needed eventually. She trusted me to find it when I was ready. The second thing is about Margaret and what the word decision actually means. Margaret made the hardest decision of her life at 22 years old. She was alone and frightened, and she chose to give me to people who would love me rather than keep me in conditions that would not have served me. She then spent 29 years thinking about me every day and writing letters to a woman in Portland twice a year so that someone would know she was still thinking. That is not abandonment. I want to say that clearly because the word abandonment was the word that came to me first on the attic floor when I was reading the letters and was frightened by what I was reading. It was the wrong word. What Margaret did was an act of love so specific and so costly that I do not have adequate language for it. She loved me enough to give me to someone else, and she loved me enough to keep knowing about me from a distance for 29 years. I have a mother. Her name is Susan, and she has known me since before I could speak, and she made my favorite cookies every Christmas because she noticed I loved them. I also have Margaret. Both things are true simultaneously, and both things are real, and I am done looking for a word that makes one of them smaller than the other. The third thing is the practical one. If there are boxes behind winter coats in anyone's attic, go look. Not because every box contains a revelation, but because the things people kept without being able to speak about them are often the truest record of what mattered to them. My grandmother kept 23 years of letters. She also wrote 23 years of letters. She did not throw them away. She did not destroy the record of a truth she could not tell me directly. She left them where someone would come looking. Someone came looking. Hi everyone. Thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, has someone ever kept something for you without telling you, and you only found it after they were gone? And which moment stayed with you longer, reading my grandmother's letters to Margaret, or Margaret writing back in 11 days? I read every single one. If this story reached you today, subscribe. What comes next will stay with you too. Emma Larson, Portland, Oregon.